In a quiet suburban neighborhood, where the houses all looked nearly identical and the lawns seemed cut to the same height, a woman named Emily Thompson tried to add a touch of color to her life. She had recently moved into the community and quickly realized the streets were lined with beige siding, gray roofs, and a uniformity that felt suffocating. To her, home wasn't just a place to live, it was a place to breathe, and beauty was part of that. So, she planted flowers. Emily spent weekends digging in her front yard, carefully arranging bright marigolds, tulips, petunias, and roses in rich, vibrant patterns. By the time spring was in full bloom, her yard exploded with color, standing out from the muted sameness of the rest of the street. Neighbors slowed down their cars just to admire it, and children stopped on their way to school to point at the blossoms. For Emily, it was a small joy, a reminder that life didn't have to be bland. But for one neighbor, it was a problem. Across the street, Karen Phillips watched the transformation with growing disdain. She was a longtime resident and self-appointed guardian of the HOA's rules. Her house, perfectly neutral in every way, reflected her obsession with control. The moment she saw Emily's flowers bloom, she decided they were unauthorized. The HOA guidelines included vague language about approved landscaping, and Karen twisted it to mean that only certain shrubs and plain green grass were acceptable. From her window, Karen scowled as families admired Emily's work. She muttered to herself that the flowers were too bright, too unregulated, and disrupted the harmony of the neighborhood. It didn't matter that they brought joy to others. What mattered was that they defied her interpretation of the rules. Karen began with the usual tactics. First came the letters. Stiffly worded notices slipped into Emily's mailbox, demanding removal of the unapproved vegetation. Then came the in-person glaze. The crossed arms and pointed looks whenever Emily watered her garden. But Emily ignored her. The HOA never formally cited her, and without official action, the letters meant nothing. Karen's frustration built. Every day the flowers seemed brighter, and every day more neighbors praised them. What should have been her victory, control over the street, was slipping away. She wanted Emily embarrassed, shamed, and forced to comply. So one afternoon, Karen did something unthinkable. She dialed 911. To the dispatcher, she exaggerated wildly, claiming the flowers were causing a public disturbance and were in violation of neighborhood safety standards. She insisted an officer be sent immediately. In her mind, this was a chance to escalate the issue beyond the HOA. She pictured police arriving, issuing fines, and ordering Emily to rip out her flowers on the spot. As she hung up the phone, Karen felt certain she had one. She stood at her window, waiting eagerly for the sound of sirens. But what she didn't realize was that her call would have consequences she never expected. Instead of Emily facing punishment, Karen herself would soon be the one answering for her actions. When the patrol car rolled into the neighborhood, its quiet presence drew more attention than Karen anticipated. Curtains shifted, doors cracked open, and neighbors peeked out to see what was happening. Karen stepped outside with a look of self-importance, ready to direct the officer toward Emily's front yard as though she were conducting official business. The officer climbed out, clipboard in hand, his expression professional but slightly puzzled. Karen immediately launched into a tirade about unauthorized landscaping, disruptive colors, and supposed safety concerns. She pointed to Emily's garden, which at that moment looked radiant in the afternoon sun, a lively patch of reds, yellows, purples, and whites glowing against the dull backdrop of the street. Emily had been kneeling in her yard, tending to her plants, when she realized the police had arrived. She stood slowly, brushing dirt from her gloves, watching with calm curiosity as Karen gestured wildly in her direction. The neighbors were now fully engaged, some stepping onto porches, others gathering on sidewalks, their expressions a mix of annoyance and disbelief. The officer listened politely to Karen's complaints, but his face revealed the truth. He didn't see a crime or even a problem. Instead, he saw a resident using a property in a way that caused no harm, no danger, and certainly no justification for emergency services. The flowers weren't obstructing sidewalks, weren't invading anyone else's property, and posed no threat to health or safety. When the officer finally walked toward Emily, it wasn't to issue a warning. It was to gather her side of the story. She explained simply that she loved gardening, that she planted the flowers for beauty, and that there had been no official HOA violation filed. Her calmness stood in stark contrast to Karen's frantic energy. The officer nodded, clearly satisfied. Then came the moment no one expected. The officer turned back to Karen and asked why she had called 911 over flowers. His tone was sharp enough to make the gathered neighbors raise their eyebrows. Emergency services, he reminded her, were for actual emergencies, not petty disputes. Wasting police resources was no small matter. Karen's confidence cracked. She tried to defend herself, repeating that the flowers weren't approved, but her words rang hollow. The officer wrote something down, handed her a slip, and explained that she would be fined for making a frivolous emergency call. The collective gasp from the watching neighbors was followed by murmurs of satisfaction. Karen had turned the spotlight on Emily, but now it burned on her instead. As the officer spoke firmly, Karen's face flushed crimson. She looked around at the neighbors, only to see their disapproving stares. The very people she thought she was protecting now saw her for what she was, a petty enforcer who had wasted everyone's time. Emily, meanwhile, quietly returned to her flowers, her dignity untouched. The blossoms swayed gently in the breeze as though mocking Karen's defeat. The officer left without further issue, but the damage was done. Karen had lost her credibility, and her reputation in the neighborhood was unraveling. But this was not the end. The HOA would soon hear of her actions, and what came next would seal her fate. Word of Karen's 9/11 stunt spread through the neighborhood faster than the blooms in Emily's garden. By the end of the week, nearly everyone knew about the fine. Families whispered about it during morning walks. Children giggled when passing Karen's house, and longtime residents shook their heads at how far she had taken her obsession with rules. The incident became the talk of the block, but not in the way Karen had hoped. The humiliation weighed on her. She avoided eye contact when walking her dog, no longer strutting with the same authority she once flaunted. She expected sympathy, or at least support from the HOA board, but what she received was the opposite. At the next meeting, her name was a focus of discussion, not Emily's flowers. Several neighbors had sent complaints to the board about Karen's misuse of emergency services. Others openly questioned whether someone with a lack of judgment should continue serving on the HOA committee. Even board members who had tolerated her strict interpretations of the rules now distanced themselves. To them, she had become a liability, dragging their association's reputation through the mud. Karen tried to argue her case, waving the HOA handbook and insisting that unauthorized landscaping violated the spirit of community guidelines. But the board members countered that the flowers harmed no one, violated no clear written rule, and in fact brought positive attention to the neighborhood. One member even suggested that Emily's yard was the most beautiful on the street. Karen's words grew weaker by the minute, drowned out by the voices of neighbors who had grown tired of her controlling behavior. By the close of the meeting, the decision was made. Not only would Emily keep her flowers, but the HOA would formally clarify landscaping rules to allow residents more freedom for personal expression. And as for Karen, she was officially reprimanded for her conduct. The message was clear. Her reign of petty control was over. Back on her side of the street, Karen seethed. She had wanted Emily embarrassed and forced to comply, yet the exact opposite had happened. Her own credibility was shattered, her influence stripped away, and the flowers she despised had become a symbol of resistance against her micromanagement. Meanwhile, Emily's garden only flourished. Neighbors began stopping by with seeds and cuttings, offering to contribute to the display. What started as one woman's love of color grew into a community effort. Soon, other homes began adding their own flower beds and planters, transforming the once bland neighborhood into a street alive with vibrancy. Karen, isolated and avoided, could do nothing but watch. Every new blossom reminded her of a failed attempt to control others. The fine she had paid was one thing, but the greater cost was a respect she had lost forever. And so, the flowers she tried to destroy became her downfall. They stood as a quiet triumph for Emily, and a constant reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of beauty can break the strongest grip of control. The woman who called 911 over flowers had tried to bring shame to her neighbor. Instead, she planted the seeds of her own regret. Do like, subscribe, and comment this story.